All right, welcome back to another installment of Pre-Calculus Review, getting us ready for the real good stuff, the calculus stuff. So, trig, one of your biggest fears, I should say. It's not just the biggest fear, you got a few, but sines, cosines, tangents tend to be one of the biggest fears that you have. Part of it is that we just don't really understand what it is. We didn't really spend the time grasping what the heck sine means. Sine is an operation. So when we're trying to solve an equation like this, the sine of 3x equals negative radical 2 over 2, we have to understand what this question is asking us. If we don't even understand what the question is asking us, it's impossible to solve. This question is asking us, what value can I plug in for x so that when I multiply that value by 3, and then take the sine of that value, the answer will equal negative radical 2 over 2. That's what we're looking at. It's important that we understand that we are taking the sine of 3x, because typically students will want to do this. I will erase this because this is totally wrong. Students will say, oh, I need to divide by sine. And you cannot do that. That is a sin. Let's see what I did there. That's funny. You cannot divide by sine. It's an operation. Dividing by sine would be the same thing as trying to divide by a plus sign. Does that make sense? Heck no, that doesn't make sense. Why would you divide by a plus sign? That doesn't make sense at all. Who divides by a plus sign? So that's the same thing when you say, I want to divide by sine. You can't divide by sine. You have to do the opposite of sine. The opposite of taking the sine of something is to take the arc sine. And so we're not multiplying by arc sine, because if you're going to multiply, you multiply by numbers, or you multiply by variables. You don't multiply by operations. You wouldn't multiply by a plus sign. So you're not multiplying by arc sine, you are taking the arc sine of both sides. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do the arc sine of the left side, the arc sine of the sine of 3x, and that's going to be equal to the arc sine of negative radical 2 over 2. So, on the left side, the arc sine of the sine, they are opposites. That's like adding 5 and subtracting 5. That's like squaring something and then taking the square root. They cancel each other out because they're opposites. That's the goal of doing the opposite. And so when I take this arc sine of the sine, all I'm left with is 3x. Students will often want to I'll divide by 3x. You can't. Parentheses lock things in. The parentheses that we have around the 3x mean it's stuck, it's locked in until the sin is gone. You cannot touch 3x. And so we get rid of the sin, we get rid of the sine by doing the arc sine. On the other side, it's important that we know what this question is asking us. The arc sine of negative radical 2 over 2. What does that mean? That is asking us what angle in a right triangle will have the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse in a ratio of negative radical 2 over 2. This is where it comes down to you memorizing the sines, the cosines, the tangents, the cosecants, secants, and cotangents of the main angles. The main angles are 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, and any of their multiples, 2 pi over 3, 11 pi over 6, etc., etc. And so you have to have this memorized. You should know what angle will give you a sine of negative radical 2 over 2. If you just think positives, forget about the fact that this is negative, pi over 4 will give you the sine of pi over 4 will give you radical 2 over 2. So it's got to be something like that. It's got to be something along the lines of pi over 4. But pi over 4 is in the first quadrant. Pi over 4 will not give you negative radical 2 over 2 when you take the sine of it, because sine's positive in the first quadrant. So you go to the second quadrant. The same angle in the second quadrant is 3 pi over 4. But again, sine's not negative in the second quadrant either, so that won't work. In the third quadrant, however, sine is negative, and so an angle of pi over 4 that's in the third quadrant would be 5 pi over 4. And so that is one possibility. However, we could also be in the fourth quadrant, and in the fourth quadrant, that would be 7 pi over 4. Both of those angles, if I take the sine of 5 pi over 4, or if I take the sine of 7 pi over 4, when I do their sine is going to be negative radical 2 over 2. So, I've got those two. There are others. We could go the negative route. 7 pi over 4 is exactly the same as negative pi over 4. 5 pi over 4 is exactly the same as negative 3 pi over 4. So I could list those as well. I really don't care. I don't need you to list all of them. I need you to understand there's more than one, usually. And I also need you to understand that we can get a ton of these if I don't put any restrictions, which I didn't on this problem, but we're just going to solve a couple of them and call it a day. So these two are good, but if we just keep going around the circle, I could keep adding 2 pi to 5 pi over 4. I could keep adding 2 pi to 7 pi over 4, and I could get 100,000 answers. We are not going to do that. However, we're not done because our goal is to solve this for x. We didn't solve it for x. I know what 3x is equal to. I need to know what x is equal to. Well, if I have 3x is equal to 12, you would divide by 3 and get x is equal to 4. If I had 3x equals 21, you'd divide by 3 and get x equals 7. We have 3x is equal to, we'll just do the first one, 5 pi over 4. 3x is equal to 5 pi over 4, fine, divide by 3. If I divide that by 3, x will end up equaling 5 pi over 12. If that blows you away, you need to refresh your fractions, because that's how you divide with fractions. Rinse and repeat. Now we'll see when 3x is equal to 7 pi over 4. Let's go ahead and solve that. Again, we'll divide both sides by 3, and so we get a second answer of 7 pi over 12. Again, if that's screwing you up, that is basic fraction work. You need to review that elementary fraction work to make sure that you're not messing that up. So this is how you solve any trigonometric function. You take the opposite of whatever you're doing. The opposite of sine, arc sine. The opposite of cosine, arc cosine. You have to get rid of that. Once you get rid of the sine or the cosine or the tangent, then you go ahead and are able to solve whatever you have here, in this case 3x, by simply doing what we normally do with functions. So, solving these isn't a bad thing, but you have to know these facts. The fact that the sine of negative radical 2 over 2 is equal to those two fractions, you have to know that. That's things that I'm expecting you to memorize, and that's why you have that on your sheet, to memorize those special angles so you don't have to worry about a calculator.